I want to break out, batter down the door, go tramping black heather all day on the windy moor, and at night, in hayloft or under hedge, find a companion suited to my mind. I want to break through, shatter time and space, cut up the void with a knife, pitch the stars from their place, not shrink back when, lidded with darkness, the eye of reality opens and blinds me, blue as the sky. Sangharakshita, poem by Sangharakshita, written, I think, sometime in the late 60s, around the time of the starting of what we call Triratna, Buddhist community, but what was called in those days the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order. I think it's a really wonderful poem, and it gives you a kind of insight, I think, into Sangharakshita's consciousness, his life at that time. And he'd lived this life in India of a pretty traditional Buddhist monk, although even in India he was very much his own man. But he followed, the Vinaya and, wore robes and living in a very traditional way. And when he came back to the UK, he started to be like that. But then gradually, as time went on, I think he realised that the situation needed something different. I'd say that sounds a bit too rational in a way. He just responded to what he found. Things started to open up in him as he responded to the people around him. So there's kind of coming together of his own unfolding Dharma life and the actual world that he was in. And clearly he wanted to break out and find a companion suited to his mind, and wanted to, break through into a new reality. Those early days after he was kind of kicked out of the then very small but quite rigid Buddhist establishment in the UK, where one of the leading Buddhists at that time encouraged him to think of himself as the Buddhist vicar of Hampstead, which was not a very attractive prospect for him, for Bhante, as we call him, Sangharakshita. No, he wanted something rather different, something very different. And he talks about that time of, wandering around London, loving the anonymity, and loving kind of sitting in working men's cafes and, these working class pubs in Kentish Town and things like that, just watching, just waiting, just seeing, just reflecting. He talks about ecstasies at that time, things really kind of opening up, his consciousness kind of flooding across the boundaries, if you like. So I wanted to start with this because, of course, around this time as well, he was giving lecture series, beginning to give lecture series and talks. And in those lecture series, you get this notion, there emerges, he teaches the Dharma, teaches Buddhism, using this language of the individual, or even the true individual, and talking about the individual, the group, the spiritual community, presenting the Dharma as part of his attempt to present the Dharma in a way that really spoke to the people of the time. At this time he was using the language of the higher evolution, this kind of thing. Very, very important way of engaging with what was around. You can imagine the late 60s, early 70s. I mean, the whole business of the individual freedom, the whole kind of melting pot of the 60s. It was quite a time. I mean, he said himself, it was quite a time with so much questioning going on. So many currents were going on in society, in all aspects of society. And he was part of that, if you like, that scene, that world. So the language of the individual, the true individual, in a sense, versus the group, and the creation of a new kind of community, a new kind of communication, was the kind of thing that was in the air, the kind of thing that was was around the kind of people that Sangharakshita was in touch with. So it's quite important to note this, that you won't find the language of the true individual in the early Buddhist scriptures, in the oldest teachings of the Buddha. I don't think you'll even find the language of the group. You'll find the language of the spiritual community, of course, because you have the Sangha in early Buddhist scriptures. But even there, if you read the text, you think, man, what is this true individual group and spiritual community all about? It's not that it's not there in principle, but it's definitely a way of translating that material from the Buddhist tradition into a way that people can really connect with. And people did really connect with it. And, the whole language of individuality was, when I was sort of around, was quite a big deal. Even misused. People forgetting that Sangharakshita made quite a sharp distinction between the true individual who has left the mass, if you like, group think, group values vertically, so to speak, from the individualist. The individualist, of course, is still defined by the group, but is, still wants the attention of the group, but is always against the group, but not really creatively. I can remember friends of mine in the order, it was one of the great rationalizations, well, I'm an individual, so it's really important that I sleep with this person. Yeah, but they're involved with somebody else. Well, that might well be, but I'm an individual. I have to listen to my body. You still hear it. I mean, it's incredible. But classic sort of rationalizations of selfishness and self-centeredness, drastapas. I'm being an individual. You used to get a lot of that. Used to find it quite irritating myself. Similarly, I think the whole business of being a group member was one of the worst sort of slurs that could be put on you. You're just a group member. Oh my God, I'm a group member. Nobody wants to be a group member. Everybody wants to be an individual. And of course that led to, I think, a certain sort of tension, or even a sort of dishonesty, perhaps a hypocrisy, because the fact is we are part of groups. We are in part of all sorts of groups, and some of those groups are actually quite positive. The spiritual community, true individuals communicating, is actually quite a rare thing. It's an unusual thing. It's not something that we should just assume that we've attained. It is an attainment, the true individual and the spiritual community. So I think there does need to, we do need to be really careful with this sort of language and approach it with a certain amount of care. So I was wondering how to approach this, and actually our speakers yesterday, they did, I think, touch on all these different areas and open out the different areas for us, very well. And they you got the kind of picture of what the true individual, the group, spiritual community are about yesterday. But I wanted to take a bit of a different approach this morning. Sanghanista and Dharmashalin both took me aside and told me things they thought I should be saying this morning. And I said, yes, okay, I'll do what you tell me. I want to take a bit of a different approach to try and get into this topic a bit more. It might seem a bit of a roundabout way of doing it, but anyway, let's see where we go. I want to refer to a lesser known teaching, if you like, of Sangharakshita's, again based on solid Buddhist tradition, that was given in a famous talk in 1979 at the London Buddhist Centre. So not long after the opening of the London Buddhist Centre, when the Nalanda crest above the big red doors was unveiled. That coincided with Padmasambhava Day. Padmasambhava being this extraordinary figure of 8th century India, but who becomes the centre of a whole cult, if you like, of myths and stories and symbolism, so that he becomes a kind of living presence within, particularly Tibetan Buddhism. So becomes an archetype of the embodiment of many archetypes and myths and symbols. And Padmasambhava has played a very important part in Sangharakshita's own life. I mean, his Buddhist teachers, Tibetan Buddhist teachers, were all of them were in one way or another devotees of Padmasambhava, and he received Padmasambhava teachings, Padmasambhava visualizations and meditations from some of these teachers, and was even given the name Urgyen Sangharakshita from the country of Urgyen, which is Padmasambhava's Pure Land, where Padmasambhava emerged. Padmaloka is also a name of Padmasambhava's Pure Land, the realm of the lotus. So Padmasambhava is important to us, and so in 1979, Sangharakshita gave this talk as part of these Padmasambhava Day celebrations on Padmasambhava, and his approach to the topic was very, very interesting. He talked about 4, if you like, archetypes, archetypal figures, which are also, if you like, 4 principles, which you can sort of see emerging in a kind of in history, in human society, even playing a part in the sort of development of, you know, the if you like, of spiritual communities, but also 4 archetypes that can play a part even in our own individual journey as well. So I want to talk about these, and I think it will shed light on the whole business of I hope it will shed light on the whole business of the individual, the group, and the spiritual community. And I thought I'd do it because I know Padmasambhava Day is coming up for some of you, and no doubt there'll be all sorts of talks and pujas, and, you know, people like to get the drums out and, you know, do all that sort of thing and do their ecstatic dancing or whatever it might be. You know, they might not kind of know more deeply what Padmasambhava is really about. So I thought, well, let's go to my gurus, my teachers, our teachers, kind of text, if you like, to get a sense of all this. So in this talk, Sangharakshita talked about these 4 figures: the Manu, the Buddha, the Guru, and the Turton. So let's go through these one by one. So first of all, the Manu. Manu is a term from Hindu tradition, even Brahminical tradition. Manu is the sort of archetypal lawgiver. The archetypal lawgiver. In Brahmanism, you have a famous text called the Manu Smriti, the recollections of Manu. It's a massive kind of Brahminical law book, not really very Buddhistic because it's very, very caste based. You know, it gives the punishments for if an untouchable happens to overhear a recitation of the Vedas, that molten lead should be poured into his ear. So obviously we're not talking about Manu in the literal sense, but Manu as a principle is the lawgiver of a society. And Sangharakshita talked about him because he's saying that he talked about a particular experience he had in India when he started to work with the ex-untouchable Buddhists, so the people from this very, very, the people completely marginalised by and discriminated against by traditional caste Hindus. There's this huge movement of conversion to Buddhism as a means of liberation and freedom in the 1950s, which Sangharakshita was very, very involved with. Indeed, the anniversary of that great conversion is coming up. It's next month, and I'll be doing a couple of talks on that, one in Cambridge and one at the LBC, the Dhamma Revolution, as we call it. So Sangharakshita was very involved in this movement, and he did these lecture tours in Maharashtra, particularly. That's the state where Bombay is, Uttar Pradesh in northern India, other places. And he'd go around giving lectures, giving talks, making connections, where people were very, very moved by his response, and we're talking thousands of people, that he was a man coming to teach the Dhamma because their great leader, Dr. Ambedkar died shortly after the Great Conversion, so they were left leaderless. But he said, Sangharakshita said, what was really interesting in that time, there was the tremendous inspiration that people felt. They felt that in leaving caste Hinduism, in taking this step to go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, it was a step towards real dignity, self-respect, liberation, because they were told there would be dire punishments for their conversion. In fact, there was nothing kind of material to be gained from the great conversion to Buddhism, but it was a step, if you like, an individual step towards liberation. It's a topic in itself. To just shrug off all the superstition and repression of centuries and centuries, thousands and thousands of years. But one of the things Sangharakshita said, as well as the tremendous sense of freedom that he encountered among people, this sort of ecstatic freedom that the Dharma was giving these people, he said what they really wanted to know about were things like, how do you do a baby naming ceremony? What's a Buddhist baby naming ceremony? Very, very important, because the traditions they came out of, when a child's born, it has to have all sorts of protective rituals. You might go to the Baba or to the temple and have various things done. So what do we do now? And of course there are baby naming ceremonies in Buddhism, and there are blessings to give. Buddhist weddings, really important, perhaps even more important. How can you do a Buddhist wedding? What's a Buddhist wedding? So Sangharakshita had to preside over Buddhist weddings, Buddhist name-giving ceremonies, Buddhist death ceremonies, again, very important. What do you do at a Buddhist funeral? What do you do after the death, months later, when you have what's known as the Punyana Modana? They wanted to know all these ceremonies, all the rites of passage, and he had to teach them all these, had to do all these. And he said that there was a friend of his, a Polish friend living in India, who was a sort of Gandhian, but a good friend of his, named Morris. In the talk, Bhante seemed to delight in talking about Morris for some reason, but anyway, so he was very fond of Morris. And Morris said to him, Sangharakshita, don't try to be a Buddha to these people. What they need is a Manu. What they need is a lawgiver. They needed somebody who's going to show them, if you like, what the positive human group society is. They've liberated themselves from, they've taken the step to liberate themselves from the oppression of caste and all the superstition that goes with it. So what kind of world, what kind of society, what kind of human society is there going to be now? So Sangharakshita was very taken with this. It wasn't so much to do with, at that time, although he did teach meditation and teach the Dharma in the full sense, he spent a lot of his time giving people the teachings for a just, positive human society, a way in which people could be together totally positively. So the Manu, if you like, is the archetype or the principle of the symbol of creating, if you like, the positive human society, the positive human group. The Buddha had to do this himself in his own day. There are a lot of teachings in the Pali Canon. For example, the Sigalavada Sutta, which is a very important sutta, where the Buddha talks about, it's not sort of higher teachings on the Lakshanas and Shunyata and things like that. It's all the teachings on how do a husband and wife communicate, how do employer-employee communicate, what are the duties in friendship. In fact, all of the different relationships are characterised in terms of duties, in parents and children and so on and so forth. Secular teachers, how do you relate to them? The Buddha had to kind of give the teachings for that positive human society. So we need that going on in our Dharma life before we can really talk about true individuality, which is a high spiritual attainment. We need to have a very we need to work, if you like, on the human level, if you like, on the healthy human level. And the healthy human level involves healthy social interaction. Has been called the positive group, which is a slightly patronising term. I'm not very comfortable. Perhaps words like a tribe would be better, or something like that, or a chivalric order, or something like that, or something like that. The old, in Iran, in ancient Iran, they had this tradition of the guilds, which were kind of chivalric guilds. Not only would you be working, as a kebab seller, or working in the baths, or the perfume maker, or the coppersmith, or the jeweler, or whatever it might be, you'd be part of a guild. You'd be part of a religious guild, where you would have, you'd have particular forms of worship, and you'd be joined, very, very closely with your brothers, in the guild, and you'd have all sorts of duties, to perform to one another. We have this the world over, these very, very positive, human groupings, human societies. Well, we need that. I think there's a problem for many modern Buddhists. People are very attracted to Buddhism for very good reasons, but in some ways they can be attracted for the wrong reasons. They associate Buddhism, I think, with something highly individualistic. They think of the solitary Buddha under the tree, or the hermit in the cave, and it's all about my mind, just my mind, what goes on in my mind. They can even stay in their bedroom. You can do it all over the internet. Apparently you can even gain enlightenment on the internet these days. You can find a mentor who will guide you through. You don't have to really do very much. You don't have to get off your bum and really do something. You can carry on sitting at your desk. I think that's a problem. I think that's a perversion of what Buddhism really is. I think also you can you sort of see people making a real sort of effort. They really push. Life is very painful, very difficult. They have all kinds of problems. They come to the Dharma because the Dharma addresses the whole problem of suffering. Fair enough. So they really go for it in meditation. On their own. And you can sort of admire the effort, but they can become really alienated, really out of touch with something really basic, their humanness. So you can get these weird distortions of Buddhism, even teachings like, for example, not self, where people are going around basically trying to pretend that they don't have feelings that they really have. Painful feelings, even unskillful emotions, or what they think of as unskillful, instinctual material. This is one of the things that Sangharakshita encountered when he first came back to Britain. He found a lot of people practicing Buddhism in the wrong way. And he described this retreat where there was a woman on a retreat. She said, Buddhism's so wonderful because it teaches there's no self. In every study group, every discussion, Buddhism is so wonderful. The Buddha is so wonderful. There's no self. There's no self, ad nauseum. And at the end of the retreat, this woman came to Bhante and said, I've realised why I'm attracted to not self, because I hate myself. I really hate myself. Well, you don't deal with that kind of psychological issue by trying to do some sort of mental trick to pretend that you're not there. You're not going to deal with it. You've got to actually face what you are, and what you are is a human. And you're in a human world. You're a man with other men. And one of the things that's so important is just simply working on that very basic human interaction. It's one of the things, a centre should really be a Buddhist centre should really be all about. In part, it should be almost. I remember Subhuti once saying that the quality of a centre, part of its quality, it should be a bit like a sort of, a city square or something like that. A sort of place where people can just very positively, in a very human way, just interact with one another. So the Manu is that way in which we can bring about this sort of very positive, healthy, human interaction. We need that. That's one of the reasons why I think you get these outstanding spiritual masters like Milarepa, like the Buddha himself. They come out of very, very positive human bases. They come out of extended families. They come out of tribal groups. They haven't got sort of weird alienated issues that so many of us moderns had. They knew who their mum and dad were. They knew who their brothers were. They knew what their lineage was. We come from a very, very fractured world, and one of the things we've got to do is to heal that on a human level. That is spiritual work. It is spiritual work. It's not, but it's human work. It's humanness that we're working on. Dr. Ambedkar, the great leader of the conversion movement to Buddhism, he used this word in Marathi, manuski, which means humanness. It's such a lovely, warm word in Marathi, manuski, humanness. It's also a kind of political word, even a revolutionary word, because it means seeing the man, seeing the human, seeing the person without outside of caste and all the rest of it. But we've got to do that. We've actually got to warm up our humanness. I think the tendency these days is to so easily reduce people to, well, we're reduced to a consumer, to what Sangharakshita calls the statistical individual, the consumer, the person on the other end of, on the Facebook page, or whatever it might be, the person on the end of the Twitter account, who's just a message, a cipher. We need to bring back the human. We need to create the human. And Dharma practice should be about creating the human. That's what the Manu is about. So when you've got that sort of reasonably positive human society, then there can emerge the Buddha, the next archetype. I mean, the Buddha emerges in ancient India. Ancient India wasn't a perfect time. It wasn't a sort of golden age. It wasn't having a reasonably positive human society doesn't mean that everybody's perfect in any way. I mean, the Buddha emerges in a world where, of course, there are all sorts of problems, but it was by and large, a pretty positive world in many, many ways for all sorts of reasons. And it was reasonably stable. Very, very difficult for a spiritual community to emerge and the Buddha to emerge, for example, in a war zone or in a civil war zone. People sometimes like the idea of romantically thinking, wouldn't it be great if we were persecuted as Buddhists? We would really, we'd really practice. Not necessarily. A lot of people would sell out. A lot of people, you'd really find out who was really doing it. A lot of us would sell out, I think. If you're in a world of terrible sort of tension and conflict, don't assume that you're going to be, we're all going to get together and really practice, strongly with one another. That's just romantic fantasy. That's you've got to be really honest with yourself. No, we need a reasonably stable environment. And in fact, we have a reasonably stable environment at the moment in the world that we're in. We can ourselves create a reasonably human kind of society. Nobody, the secret police aren't going to come and close us down this weekend. Militants aren't going to come and shoot us up and destroy our Buddha images, which it would be in some cultures and societies. So we need this good human society. So the Buddha arises in that. And even though it's quite positive, and in a way he grows up within a very positive environment, doesn't he, Siddhartha Gautama? It's quite obvious. He grows up, in a world that is very, very supportive of a healthy human life. He's trained as a warrior. He has, really good environment. But the thing is, it's stifling. It's utterly stifling, as it was for many people at that time. It's one of the characteristics of that time, the emergence of the Buddha, was there seems to have been a real curiosity, a real questioning, in a sense, about what life was for. You have this movement going on called the Shramana movement. Shramana meaning something, well, we can just call it wanderer. People just leaving home, leaving their tribe, leaving their caste, leaving their country, and wandering to search. to search for the truth. And the Buddha was one of those. You find it's very, very powerful in the early text. You find this, the sutta, very old sutta, which would have been like an old ballad really that was sung, called the Going Forth, the Padmavajra Sutta, where Ananda is singing the way the Buddha, what the Buddha's words when he's contemplating his going forth. So he sings. So we have to imagine this being sung. Cramped is this life at home, dusty indeed its sphere. A life gone forth is wide open. You live out under the open sky. He saw this and he went forth. Very, very simple, direct, concrete language. So it's literally living out under the open. Literally having nothing, living out that wonderful openness. But it's also a metaphorical opening up to the possibilities, the vast space that's opening up. You've given up, your whole career, that's, the tracks that you're being sent down to becoming a prince, a king, a leader, with all the sort of caste duties. Good though that might be, you're giving it up. You don't know where you're going. You don't know what you're doing. You just know that there are very, very serious questions that are not being answered. Basically, what is this life for? If it ends in old age, disease and death, what is this life actually about? That's the emergence of a real individual. If you want to put it in, simple, language, an individual, a true individual begins to emerge when you genuinely have that question. It's got nothing to do with just simply reacting to your parents or reacting to the various groups around you. It's when that question really hits you. What? What? Not just a vague philosophical questioning, but it's what do I do? Those moments when you wake up in the middle of the night, maybe when you're on your own, in the dark, okay, even though you might have been a Buddhist for a long time, and you think you've got your path. Have you ever had those moments where you wake up, what? What? Before the sex fantasies start, or whatever it is. What? What is it going to be? What do I do? And that visceral kind of ache, right there in the chest or just below the chest. What am I doing? That is the beginnings. That's the beginnings of true individuality. And then actually looking, really searching, really trying to find a way. So and of course the Buddha did find that with his attainment of enlightenment. I won't go into the attainment of enlightenment, but he found the answer, and he taught it. And he taught it because, he was available to other people with that what. What do I do? So many poignant stories that you hear in the Pali Canon. People from all sorts of, backgrounds, all sorts of circumstances. And there's this kind of electricity that's around in the really early days. But particularly, you probably heard that story of Yasha, the young playboy. Apparently no interest whatsoever in any kind of spiritual life. He's a pampered son of a Varanasi merchant. Wakes up in the middle of the night after a carousing, this fantastic party with, all of his, musicians with not a man among them, entertaining him. And he wakes up in the night, and there's just in this chamber, just one oil lamp burning, and he looks around and he sees these women in various states of undress, these beautiful, alluring musicians, and they're asleep. And they're all sorts of, they're just spread over cushions and instruments, breasts hanging out, snoring, making kind of muttering noises. And he looks at it, and he just says, this is horrible. This is terrible. This is horrible. And he's absolutely overwhelmed with terrible fear. It feels as if he's in a He's in a charnel ground. He's in a cremation ground. He's in a place of the dead. And he feels just utter disgust at himself, at his life, at this complete illusion that he's sort of seeing through. It must have been so unreal, so weird. He's totally weirded out. And the story goes, he just dashes out into the night, just shouting, "It's horrible, it's horrible." And he's got, goosebumps going all over him. He's just in a right state, and he just runs to, the deer park. He's just running out into the night, and he's going, "It's horrible, it's horrible." And suddenly this voice comes from the darkness and says, "This isn't horrible. This isn't terrible." And he just stops and just sees the Buddha, who's just sitting there, just saying, "This is not horrible." It's really one of those, weird moments, as if the Buddha's saying that his state, sitting here in this beautiful park in the middle of the night, a warm, time of year would have been kind of monsoony kind of time, so it's nice and hot and steamy and, very lush. And it's not horrible. And they talk, and the Buddha sees that he sees the individual. He sees in Yasha yes, he's woken up. He's asking the question. And he sees and he tunes in, and there's this wonderful interaction where through the communication, Yasha enters the stream that leads only to Buddhahood, to nirvana. Out of the corner of his eye, the Buddha sees Yasha's dad coming to find him. He'd been sent out by Yasha's mother. Goes, "Get out, go and find him, he's lost." You can imagine a little domestic scene going on there. And the Buddha sees Yasha's dad out of the corner of his eye, and he realises that if his dad comes, even though Yasha's a stream entrant, he will pull him back from gaining full liberation, full enlightenment. So he sort of creates a kind of magic mandala which Yasha disappears into. And Yasha's dad comes and he said, "Have you seen my son?" And the Buddha says, "Well, just wait, maybe he'll turn up." And they have a chat, and of course Yasha's dad becomes a stream entrant, so meanwhile Yasha's attained enlightenment, so he can come back, and anyway, and they all live happily ever afters. But the thing is, there's this electricity. I mean, Yasha tells all his friends and all his fellow playboys, all these young people, and they all enter the Dharma life. They all go for refuge. They all become monks. It's really, really lively. There's a tremendous energy. So what's going on? What's going on here? How can we relate this to this business of, the true individual? The Buddha's gone out there on his own, gained enlightenment. I thought somebody in their talk talked about the Buddha's aloneness. I think it was Sadhamani's talk about all the different groups that he just kept going forth from. There's a lovely poem by Sangharakshita where he talks about the Buddha finding enlightenment in the alone. In the alone he finds the all. This deep aloneness, totally with himself under the Bodhi tree, gaining enlightenment, leaving behind, all those different groups. But he comes back because out of compassion, out of love, because he wants to, because this enlightenment's not one-sided. It involves both self and other. It's not just a personal possession, as it were. So when the Buddha tunes into people, what he's tuning into is that individuality, that unique kind of quality, that unique aspect of a person that just wants that freedom, that liberation. That's really all the Buddha sees. Yes, he gives all the different teachings on ethics and meditation and wisdom. But as much as anything else, it's the Buddha seeing that unique individuality. In a way, seeing that, what he has fully developed in himself, coming forth, struggling forth in the people that he's meeting. The Buddha's whole way of seeing us is totally different from the way we see each other. You know, we see each other usually in terms of, our own desires and aversions and our own delusion. You know, if we see somebody we like the look of, we're attracted to them. If we see somebody we don't like the look of, we stay away from them, and all this takes place in confusion and delusion. Apparently when you go into a room, I don't know if this is one of those urban myths, but you're immediately checking out on some level or other who's worth spending time with and who isn't. It's got nothing to do with what they're actually like. It's just to do with their look, perhaps even their smell, and all that kind of thing, and your immediate instincts. It's not individual, and it's not about them as individuals. It's entirely animal, probably psychological, and that's why it's also a bit weird. You know, you hit on somebody. I'm not talking about anything sexual, but you might go into on this retreat, you might have thought, oh, he's a really interesting looking guy, and you go and talk to him, oh my God, he's really boring. How do I get out of this conversation? And then you can have the other side. You're with somebody who you've been trying to avoid all weekend, and right at the end you have a chat with him, you think, oh damn, they're really interesting. I wish I'd spent more time with them. That's group. That's nothing to do with individuality. It's all reactive mind. The Buddha doesn't do that. All the Buddha sees is potentiality for liberation. That's what he sees. He sees the total kind of humanness of people, and seeing in a way where they are in relation to liberation. Directly, not as an idea. And you get these amazing stories where the Buddha's giving a discourse, and very, very quickly at the beginning he's checking out who can really hear the teaching here. Who's really going to get it in this moment? And there's lovely stories. One of my favourite is of a leper. He's not interested in any kind of spiritual life, Dharma life. He just sees a crowd of people and he thinks food. Food, let's get over there and beg. Let's get some food. The Buddha sees him and he thinks, this guy, this one. Probably doesn't even think it. He just knows this man is on the edge of seeing things as they are. And he just turns the teaching just for this man in that assembly, and he becomes enlightened. So that's the way the Buddha is seeing the world. He's seeing it entirely in terms of individuals and individual development, and gives them the teaching appropriate to them. It also means, it explains, I think, the Buddha's absolute loyalty to the aspiring individual, even if that's going to go right against the currents of the time. There's a very, very powerful story. Some of you might find this a rather disturbing story, but I think it's important that you know about it. It's about a monk named Sangamaji, whose name means bond-free, free of bonds. And he's meditating out in the open. And Sangamaji has left home, left a wife and a child. We don't really know the circumstances, but he's gone forth. He's sitting there meditating, and his ex-wife turns up with his son, puts his son in front of him and says, here's your son, wanderer, and marches off. And Sangamaji just sits there for the rest of the day in meditation while this baby is in front of him. Just sits there, not doing anything, carries on meditating. And the Buddha's watching this whole scene. And a little later on, the ex-wife comes along, picks up the son and says, this wanderer doesn't even want his son. Because in India, in a way, a son is more important than a wife. Because it's, in a sense, it's your immortality. So the wanderer doesn't even want his son. And the Buddha's comment on this is really interesting. He says he grieves not at her coming. He grieves not at her going. This Sangamaji really is free of bonds. And I don't think much of the Buddha. I think the Buddha's wrong, and so on and so forth. And one of the things I think the story illustrates, of course, is that everybody's sympathy is going to be with the wife and the child, with the family. Nobody will have sympathy for the wanderer, for the individual, for the aspiring wanderer. The Buddha's sympathy, his compassion, is that in that moment is for the wanderer, for the aspiring individual and his liberation. Maybe that's something you can discuss a bit later on. So the Buddha is concerned with the emergence of the individual. So this talk is going on a bit long, isn't it? I've still got 2 figures to go through. I'll try and finish up. I'll deal with these a little more swiftly. So, okay, let's suppose you take up an individual spiritual life. There, like Sangamaji or like Yasha or any of these great disciples of the Buddha. You're really living the life. Somebody in their talk yesterday quoted Sangharakshita talking about the strain of individuality, the strain of leading a Dharma life. Because you're spread out. Not all of you is on the path. You have a vision of what is possible. You are living from the what. But there's all this emotional material which is not part of that. So what do you need then? Yes, the Buddha has to become, as it were, the guru. The guru. The guru, if you like, is the person, the principle, perhaps even the community, perhaps that quality that you invoke in your Dharma life that engages with all that difficult, unregenerate emotional material and brings it up along the path, brings it with you, transforms it along the path. That's what the Guru does, and Guru Padmasambhava does it par excellence. I was talking to Simon this morning, and he was very, very taken with the image of Padmasambhava in the burning ground, partly because he said it reminded him of, how did you describe it? The metal Buddha, the punk Buddha. Which is very interesting because it's talking about, it suggests the transformation of energies into the path. But the image of Padmasambhava in the cremation grounds dancing with the Darkinis is the image of the transformation of all this swirling, dark, not necessarily evil, but it's sort of instinctual energy. It's all got to get incorporated along the path. It's a famous passage in the life of Padmasambhava, a whole chapter devoted to his conversion of the gods of Tibet who are obstructing the flow of the Dharma, the establishment of the Dharma in Tibet. The gods of Tibet are not killed off. They're not killed off. They're transformed. They're made protectors of the Dharma. So one of the things you're going to have to do in your Dharma life, in one way or another, is to transform all this emotional material. As an aspiring individual, you step out. You step out from the mass. You have to stretch yourself. A true individual is somebody who's incorporated, transformed all the kind of emotional material that's preventing your growth and development, and enriching them on the path. This is a big topic. In a way, I'd like to sort of go more into it, give examples of it, but I don't really have the time, for that, how you might do that. But it does also explain why in our Sangha there's so much emphasis on things like, really getting deeply into the arts, deeply into beauty, deeply into, things like physical exercise needs a place in the Dharma life, why we have a house of strength at Padmaloka. You need that kind of energy incorporated into the path. It's why nature is so important, really feeling that you're a part of nature, so many things. It's why friendship is so important, really strong bonds of friendship, passionate friendship, to transform all this material. It's all part of the path. So that when you meditate, it's not from there up. You're meditating totally. From here, from deep down in yourself. You're bringing the Dharma into your deepest, darkest, most sort of primal energies. It's all got to come, along the path, with us. And that's what the Guru does. That's what Padmasambhava does. It's why we have all the imagery
or the colour. It's to get it in, to get it right into, the centre of the chest. And it's there is we don't want to end up with a kind of a Buddhism that's a sort of ghost of itself, a kind of spectre of Buddhism, head Buddhism. And this is powerful stuff. I mean, when you start touching transformation, it can be really frightening. When Buddhism really starts coming into the centre of your chest, when it starts coming right into your belly, into your bones, into your marrow, it gets a bit scary. I remember after I was ordained by Sangharakshita, and what happens at ordination is that you're really seen. That's what I felt. I was really seen by Sangharakshita. It was as if Sangharakshita, not without any words, but through the ritual of the ordination, was making it very, very clear to me that this isn't a game. Taking me more seriously, if you like, my individuality, my aspiring individuality, more seriously than I was taking myself. And in the private ordination, you go alone to your preceptor. It's just you and your preceptor. It was just me and Sangharakshita, where he named me, where he introduced me to my guardian Buddha, if you like, my particular deity that's going to keep an eye on me, if you like, my heavenly twin that's going to bring about my transformation. But after that ordination, I had an extremely powerful dream, a kind of waking, semi-waking dream, where a lightning bolt was emanating from a tanka of Padmasambhava, I had in my room, Padmasambhava on a copper-coloured mounting. A lightning bolt was just flashing to my chest, and I knew that if it hit me, I would die. I would just be incinerated there in that moment. It was like a current of electricity going straight to my vitals, and I had to force myself out of my sleep and grab my spiritual friend Visantra, who was sleeping on the floor next to me, and wake him up muttering, "It's the painting, it's the painting." So you're dealing with strong stuff if you take this seriously, if you really get into it. You are going to encounter the Guru. So what do you need then? You also need the terton. The terton is the treasure finder, the treasure finder. The treasure finder, this is something out of the Nyingma tradition. The treasure finder are these emanations of Padmasambhava disciples who find these hidden treasure teachings, which are the teachings appropriate for the Dharma in the particular time and place. The mythology is that Padmasambhava buried all sorts of teachings in Tibet, in caves, in statues, in images, in buildings, in the ground, in the sky, on mountain peaks, even in mind itself, in pure, enlightened, non-dual consciousness. And he predicted his various disciples to be reborn in the future, who also regarded as emanations of him, Padmasambhava himself, to find these teachings so that you have exactly the right teaching at the right time, in the right moment, that really is for you now. You need to discover that. You need to discover that in your practice. You will discover that if if you're part of a vital spiritual community and you're really living a Dharma life. You will find the teaching that will be exactly what you need at any particular moment to come full circle to Sangharakshita's teaching in 1979 at the LBC. He pointed out that in the stories of Padmasambhava, one of them concerns the transformation of this massive kind of cosmic demon, control freak called Tapa Nagpa, Black Salvation, Black Liberation. Incredible name, isn't it? Black Liberation. He's this kind of archetypal demon who has to be converted. He's also known as Matarangara, which means the one who devoured his mother, because he ate his mum to stay alive. Freudian or what. But this demon who Padmasambhava converts the Dharma keeps coming back, will always keep coming back. He's a tremendous kind of character. He's a kind of super Mara. And Tapa Nagpo's body, Rudra, he's also known as Rudra, which means terror. It's also one of the names of Shiva, which is interesting. Pervades, if you like, the whole of the world. But the Turton, the treasure finder, finds the dharma, the treasure, within the body of Tapa Nagpo. He finds it in his eyes, in his marrow, in his heart, in his bones, in his blood. He finds it there. And Sangharakshita said, well, it's really interesting. Here we are in a Buddhist centre, right in the heart of the East End. Down the road there is the City of London. And he said when he first came back to England and he was being taken through the city, he said, this is what we're up against. This is what needs to be taken on. This is what needs to be transformed. Mammon, which is so pervasive, so all-pervading. But we've got to find the teaching, the Dharma, within all that, within ourselves. Actually, I've mentioned the individual, the group. We find that, I think, particularly with spiritual community. Spiritual community. You're going to find the teaching you really need through intense interaction with other individuals, other aspiring individuals. Think about a spiritual community, what you're attempting to do within that. When a spiritual community happens, it comes about when each one of us is seeing each other purely in terms of their aspiration to individuality, their aspiration to liberation, beyond all of our trips about one another, all our labellings about one another. We're trying to see like the Buddha sees other people. We're trying to see one another like that. All we're about is bringing about the liberation, the maturing of the liberation of the heart, as the Buddha calls it. That maturing, that unfolding, that transformation. When you get communication like that, you really find the teachings that you need at any time. So, there are my thoughts on the individual, the group, the spiritual community.
Get in there.
There's another little teaching I want to mention of Sangharakshita's. I think it's so important to bear in mind. After I was ordained, a year or two after, there was an order convention. And he gave a talk on that convention called A Vision of History. And his vision of history was a vision of warfare between the group and the spiritual community. The spiritual community made up of individuals, aspiring individuals, really concerned for liberation. The group concerned with everything that goes against the individual and the spiritual community. And he talked about different spiritual communities, Buddhist spiritual communities. You might be surprised to hear even early Christian spiritual communities. And especially he talked about a religion which some of you might not have heard of, Manichaeism, which we know very little about because it was more or less wiped out. It was a kind of dualism, vegetarian, non-violent, a lot of emphasis on the arts, very big in Central Asia, Iran, other countries, China even. And it was wiped out by a combination of Zoroastrianism and Islam. And one of the things Sangharakshita was saying to us was, of course, we're such a young order, still are actually. We are still a young order. We're so young, so small. But he's saying you're part of this tradition. He's saying human life, human beings have always wanted to come together as individuals within spiritual communities. You inherit that tradition, but you have to fight for it. And the enemies to it are within you. The forces of the group, individualism are within you, and they're out there in the world too. And the thing is, you don't fight, can't fight in the way the group fights. The only weapons you have are metta, non-violent.